academically, an A was a really good grade. An A was really hard to get. A B you could be proud of, and C's were not uncommon. And furthermore, the attitude toward free speech was absolutely taken for granted that I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That was the faculty's attitude toward intellectual inquiry. There was never a hint of, oh, you shouldn't say this because it'll hurt somebody's feelings or because it's evil or whatever else. That was totally missing. I'm out of there in 1965. 2 years later, I'm in Thailand reading stories of uh, people preventing Secretary of Defense McNamara from giving a speech at Harvard.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you.
Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 383. I'm talking to Charles Murray, who has a long career as a scholar, analyst, going back to the 60s. We're going to talk about all of his work today, and because he's also got a whole lot of books, and he's got a lot of books in his background. So he's coming to us from Maryland. How are you, Professor Murray?
I'm doing well, except that, Chris, I've never been a professor, so I think probably
sorry.
Charles works as well as anything else.
Okay, I wasn't. Yeah, that's true. I guess it's just one of those things I by default call people who are famous and do this kind of work. Yeah, you never have been a professor. You've been
Huh?
a policy analyst.
Yeah.
So the first, you've got a long list of books here on Amazon, and just looking at. I noticed you mentioned also your Grokpedia. That was the first time. The first time I looked at Grokpedia, it had all your books too. So the first thing I'd like to start out with is, how did you get into all this?
That takes me back a long way, but it's fairly straightforward. I've been in Peace Corps in Thailand, 1965 to 67. And my wife at that time had been a Fulbright scholar, and she had an obligation to pay off in terms of a teaching obligation in Thailand at the university there. And so we needed to stay in Thailand. She is Thai. And so we needed to stay. And so I needed a job and income. And I got one directing a study of the Thai villagers and their attitudes toward the government. And I really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed writing it up. I enjoyed doing the research. And I actually directed that study. They hired me as the director of it, even though I had no qualifications for doing that. And I thought, this is really cool. I can do this as my career, applied research, and I can live in all these different countries over the course of those years. And so that's what initially got me going. Then a few years later, I decided that I wanted to learn quantitative methods. So I went to graduate school and learned all those quantitative methods, which would enable me to not just give a narrative, but to prove that I was right and other people were wrong, which is very attractive to me. And I worked in the profession of program evaluation until the early 1980s. Here's what happened. I was working on contract to the US government on almost all of these things, evaluating programs that they were evaluations that, as far as I can tell, were never read by anybody except the monitor of the contract that required the evaluation. They had no effect on anything. And furthermore, the programs that I was evaluating were uniformly failures. And I was on a very high class form of welfare. I worked hard. I worked 70, 80-hour weeks. But it was welfare in the sense that I wasn't producing anything that anybody wanted to buy. So I just simply left that job in 1981 and struck out on my own, thinking I could support myself by freelance consulting. And also I had a book in mind I wanted to write. And I'll cut the story short there, except to say that I was got given the opportunity to write another book, not the one I originally wanted to write. That book turned out to be Losing Ground. Losing Ground was an unexpected success, and I've been getting away with it ever since. So that's been
Yeah.
I like to say to people, I haven't gone to an office regularly since 1981, and that is correct. It's pretty much the ideal job.
That is nice. I do remember you said, in one of your books that you'd gotten into Ayn Rand as a teenager. What can you tell us about that?
I first read actually, my elder sister told me about the Fountainhead, I think maybe when I was only in 7th or 8th grade, and I read it and really loved it. And then I remember reading Atlas Shrugged in high school, it would have been. I have a real rarity. I have a copy of Atlas Shrugged, paperback copy, that is still dedicated to Nathaniel Branden because, of course, she took away that dedication after the split. And it's a dog-eared copy because I have read it a couple of times, no, more than a couple of times. And I will tell you, my mature take on Ayn Rand is contained in a review of 2 biographies of her that I wrote for Claremont Review. And essentially, I said, the novels are the heart of Ayn Rand's contribution, not objectivist philosophy. That it was the ability of the novels to evoke a very attractive ideal that I think is the source of her influence. And that whereas I am still very attracted to Galt's Gulch
Mhm.
as a community, I also think that Ayn Rand betrays a lack of dealing with the hard cases. And by that I mean in neither The Fountainhead nor in Atlas Shrugged do we have small children with wasting diseases. Do we have elderly? Do we have people with terrible handicaps? Do we have people who, through no fault of their own whatsoever, got the short end of the stick on a wide variety of characteristics? And so that limits my ability to uh, adopt her view of the world wholly. And I'm much more receptive, and this has gotten true as I've gotten older. I'm much more receptive to the complexities of the human condition and the difficulties of dealing with things.
I can see that. You were at Harvard and MIT. Were you involved with they had some pretty big clubs back then. Were you involved with those clubs any back then in the '60s or not?
No, actually, I stayed clear of things involving politics from the time I went to Harvard until until actually the 1980s. During that time, I considered myself politically kind of a casual liberal. I voted for Lyndon Johnson unenthusiastically in 1964. Uh, and I remember in the early 1980s thinking of that maybe some of my views were quite, conservative slash libertarian, but that if I actually was conservative or libertarian, I'd have to hang out with those people, and those people seemed like they would be dreadfully dull. I would see a guy like Bill Buckley on firing line and think, well, he's pretty, uh, he's not boring and stuck in the mud and middle class and playing golf every day. But that's the way I thought of conservative. So anyway, I was apolitical in an odd sort of way for a guy who subsequently would become known as an ideologue. I didn't really convert to a philosophical libertarianism until I was working on Losing Ground. And by the way, the person who was instrumental in getting me the offer to write Losing Ground was a woman, Joan Kennedy Taylor. I don't know if you ever knew her, but
I did not know her, but I certainly know of her. She
you
was
know of her.
yeah,
Yeah.
she did a lot of good work.
Yeah, he
She
sure did.
died back in the when did she die? Was it in the 90s or something like
No, it was, a mid-2000s, and,
okay, yeah. She's been gone a while, but I certainly know who Joan Kennedy Taylor was. Yeah, she was,
well, she was a very close became a very close friend. She
oh,
was,
yeah.
down
I
at our
heard
visited our home many times. It was Joan Taylor who, when she visited us when we moved out to Burkittsville, Maryland, introduced me to Carl Hess, who lives or lived across the mountain from us, and it
yeah,
was,
he lived in, the east the 3 one of the 3 eastern counties in West Virginia,
right.
Kearneysville, but yeah, far east West Virginia, which wouldn't have been too far from Maryland, your part of Maryland at all.
No, it was about a 45-minute drive to go over to his house. And during it was when I was writing the last chapters of Losing Ground that I was trying to come up with policy recommendations, and all of my policy recommendations were either libertarian or libertarian adjacent.
Yeah,
And, getting rid of the entire welfare system, school vouchers instead of, public schools and so forth. And it was that was the beginning of me recognizing in myself that I was a classical liberal or libertarian, whichever you wanna call it.
yeah. Yeah, that's why that's certainly very wild. Also, I gotta ask, you went to Harvard in the early '60s, and you were even at Harvard during the Kennedy assassination, but what was the tuition at Harvard at that time?
$1,500 per year, which if you inflate that to 25,000 would be, I don't know what, maybe
Yeah.
12,000, 15,000 max. And, the total costs per year, all 4 years, there was no change, were about $3,200 to go to Harvard. Uh, and you look at what's happened to the prices since, and it's
Yeah,
like,
I always like to
uh,
ask that because just looking at what has happened to the price of college since then. Because I mean, 3,200, you probably could have got well, that would have been a really nice car, for example, for that
yeah,
price.
yeah, yeah, that's about it. Yeah, that's and you could my father could afford to send me to Harvard. He made too much money for me to get a scholarship, but he was making about $38,000 a year at $61, which again would inflate up to a couple $100,000 a year. But you can't send somebody to Harvard on a couple $100,000 a year uh, these days very easily at all. It's just been priced out. It's ridiculous. Okay.
Yeah, it's been priced out too. I do gotta know what was the mood on the campus on that day? I mean, that was 8 years before I was born when Kennedy got assassinated because you had that recording of your radio announcement.
Yeah, yeah,
I love that. That's one thing I love. We have all this living history now. It's yeah,
yeah. I was at the WHRB radio station, the Harvard radio station at the time the news came through. And, since I was, head of announcing at that time, they called me in to make the announcement, and they gave me the AP Dispatch, and I have often said to myself, "If you had tucked that piece of paper into your pocket and kept it, it would be worth a hell of a lot of money right now." But I didn't. Yeah, the it was just I can only accurately report my own reaction, but it was like a death in the family. Because whereas I was not political, I was a big John Kennedy fan at that point, and more for cosmetic reasons than anything that he actually accomplished,
mm,
but that didn't assuage the grief that I felt, and, that stuck with me. Now that I know a lot more about him, I have, fallen out of love with John F. Kennedy, but at the time, the shock was deep and real and lasting.
I can imagine. It's I yeah. I mean, I well, I was yeah, and of course he was a Harvard boy, so that probably made it even more
Mm,
so.
yeah.
So yeah, so losing ground, what was the reaction? And it's funny, this was also happening, during the Reagan '80s. So a lot of people were reconsidering things. Was that
Uh,
really the first book to take on the Great Society and the welfare state? And
yeah, it was very unexpected success. And by success, I don't mean that it sold a lot of copies. It didn't. It sold a couple of thousand copies, but it was really noticed in Washington and around the Beltway. And whereas now people have forgotten about it, at the time, it was a very vitriolic reaction from the left. And I was called nearly as many names after Losing Ground came out as I was called later for the Bell Curve. And I was also accused of, you know, fudging the data to fit my preconceived conclusions, and that the idea was that went out that I had been paid a lot of money to write a book to order for the Manhattan Institute, which was this conservative think tank. I, I got a $30,000 advance on royalties. And that's what supported me while I wrote Losing Ground. And I subsequently eventually paid all of that $30,000 back. And so it cost the Manhattan Institute nothing to finance it. The reason for the reception being so strong was that I was not playing by the rules. At that time, there was it was almost like a kabuki dance that everybody followed. Liberals were the people who were kind of soft-headed and bleeding hearts, but their hearts were trying to help. Their intentions were wonderful. They were trying to help people. Conservatives were the ones who were moaning and groaning about welfare queens and saying we're spending too much money and wanted to cut budgets and rip food from the mouths of the starving poor. And I was saying that the real victims of the Great Society programs were the poor, and especially young people, poor young people, and most especially Black poor young people, because what happened was that the rules of the game for them had been changed in ways that created incentives to engage in really destructive long term behavior, whether that be skipping school or crime or getting on welfare or having babies without being married, and that they were responding rationally to the ways in which uh, the rules of government had been changed. And we ought to get rid of these things to not to save money, but to stop damaging the lives of poor people. And that was unfair. I mean, it was I was not playing my assigned role as a conservative. I was poaching on the liberals' moral preening, and they came after me.
I can imagine, and they've always had this, moral preening, and I also, like the comment that Robert Bidnotto made once when he said, "Criminality causes poverty," and really it does. In a lot of ways, it creates this vicious cycle where you engage in behaviors that keep you poor in a lot of ways. I mean,
Yeah. Oh,
we do have people that are just have bad luck, but then there are people who really overcome that.
and a lot of you've got to remember that a lot of these decisions that lead to a lifetime of welfare dependency or misery and poverty are being made by teenagers. And teenagers are
Yeah.
not really that good at decision making, and they are not that good at thinking long term. And so it turns out that say you're a boy, you're an inner city kid, and in 1960, before all this happened, and you're thinking about the criminal justice system then, if you were in a high school at that point, you did not have any friends who were engaging in serious crimes and getting away with it for a long period of time. Because if they were knocking over liquor stores or mugging or so forth, the clearance rates are such that you could get away with it once or twice. But if you did it very many times, odds were you were going to end up in a reform school. And because that's just the implication of a system in which at that time, the police were enforcing laws much more effectively than they do now, and the courts were sending kids off to reform schools. If instead, by 1965, 66, you know lots of kids in your high school who are committing crimes, embezzling or stealing, mugging, and getting away with it, all at once, crime does pay, and it pays in terms of the examples you're seeing around you. And it is not it is not adolescents behaving irrationally to keep on doing those things.
Yeah.
So, that's just one example of many.
Yeah, they actually see where crime can pay when you see the drug dealer driving the fancy car or, you know,
Yeah.
and they just see that as and in a lot of cases, I wonder too if they don't see any other way to get out of this.
Uh,
where I grew up, a lot of, I certainly knew plenty of people who graduated high school with me who ended up going into the military.
yeah.
'Cause that was a way out, and a way out that was legal and didn't break the law, and you serve your country and try to do the right thing. Because
Yeah.
but then
And
you have some who just
you also had the examples of, if you were a working class guy at that point, your own father was likely to be an example of how he got out, and that he's a plumber, he's an electrician, he's a house painter or whatever, and he's making enough money to put a roof over the head of the family and enough to, uh, put food on the table. And so if he could do it, you say to yourself, well, I can do it too. If instead you're in a neighborhood where not only do you not have a father yourself, none of your friends has fathers, well, you're a male, you're going to do what teenage males really like to do, and that's find a role model. And your role model is likely to be the most successful other teenage males. And as you say, it's going to be the kid who deals drugs and has a cool car. It's
yeah,
the degree to which life became hard for poor people to make the right decisions as teenagers
yeah,
because of government policy is really appalling.
yeah, I'm wondering, do you think it's as much the welfare state, or do you think it's also maybe things like, feminism and no-fault divorce?
Yeah, and
Because those
certainly,
came about the same time.
yeah, you had a perfect storm, but you also had the pill
Yeah,
that came
yeah,
around
you
at the
do.
same time, which did not necessarily change sexual behavior among poor kids, but it sure changed sexual behavior among the elites. And along with those changes in sexual behavior among the elites came a profound change in the stigma that was attached, for example, to having a baby out of wedlock.
Oh, yeah.
And a great deal of what drove the behavior of females in those days was not fair, but it's true that the woman is left holding the baby if she has a baby without a guy to take care of it. And that was a very frightening prospect economically, socially, every other way. You take away that stigma, at the same time, you augment the payments you get from the government when you have the baby, and that's a very potent combination. It's going to increase out of wedlock births.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's not that government policy operated alone. It was, to overuse a cliche, a perfect storm of influences. But the government policy, I think, accelerated all of these things
yeah.
substantially.
I can that's I did yeah, I did the thought of that too, though. You were a teenager before the pill,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
and I think, of course, back then, you'd watch these movies, you'd see if the kids were getting too close at a dance, the chaperone would come and say, "Separate."
well,
Yeah,
I,
but
I was yeah, I was a teenager in the 50s,
yeah,
and if you want to say that it didn't affect guys' behavior, you are wrong. It affected my behavior big time with my girlfriend because I knew that if I got her pregnant, I would have to marry her. I
yeah,
would have to. My parents would insist on it, as well as her mother would insist on it. And so, guess what? I I made sure that there was no way that I could impregnate my girlfriend. I restrained my very strong teenage
yeah.
impulses at that time.
Or you just kept your clothes on, but you made out instead of.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's unfortunate because I think it's kind of unfortunate that everybody seems to have lost interest in just making out,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it was something you could do and you didn't have to. And they're really, and the biggest risk was mononucleosis or.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. It's, the it was a very destructive decade in so many different ways.
Yeah, it was. You got to ask too is what was you've certainly seen what was the overall environment at Harvard like back then? I mean, it certainly wasn't this crazy
No,
left
no.
woke nonsense that we see now.
There was a night and day change that occurred within a couple of years of my graduation. So I was there 61 to 65, and, during those 4 years, women were allowed in the Harvard houses, dormitories, for a couple of hours on, Saturday afternoon and a very limited number of other hours. They were called parietal hours, and, the same was true for the girls up at Radcliffe. They boys were only allowed in their rooms for very short periods of time, and there were other people around all the time as well. You wore a jacket and tie to every meal at Harvard. In the houses, that was required. And, academically, an A was a really good grade. An A was really hard to get. A B, you could be proud of, and Cs were not uncommon. And furthermore, the attitude toward free speech was absolutely taken for granted that I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That was the faculty's attitude toward intellectual inquiry. There was never a hint of, "Oh, you shouldn't say this because it'll hurt somebody's feelings or because it's evil," or whatever else. That was totally missing. I'm out of there in 1965. 2 years later, I'm in Thailand reading stories of, uh, people preventing, Secretary of Defense McNamara from giving a speech at Harvard. I'm, I'm learning that they now had coeducational dormitories at Harvard, and, and I'm also learning that, that you have riots that shut down the administration, anti-war riots that shut down the school. So I was literally in the last years of traditional Harvard. It's never been the same since.
I can imagine. Do you suppose all of this really would this have happened if we'd not been involved in the Vietnam War?
Probably the sexual revolution would have happened, period.
Yeah.
And with that, there would have been a variety of changes. But would there have been the same rise in a radical left view? Maybe yes, but it would have grown out of the civil rights movement and would have taken a somewhat different course. However, that alone, the the 1964 Civil Rights Act was a classic example of a well-intentioned act that could have actually been good if it had limited itself to saying the government shall be forbidden from discriminating on passing laws that require people to discriminate by race. No Jim Crow laws. Okay, that would have been great.
Yeah.
But as soon as the freedom of association was breached by the public accommodation rules of that people had to serve everybody. And once the notion of equal treatment as individuals was breached in affirmative action, whereby it wasn't just that you made sure that blacks were not excluded from the hiring process, but you demanded that in effect, that enough be hired.
Mhm.
Those deformed some core American principles of treating people as individuals and American freedom, which should include the freedom to be prejudiced, as long as it did not involve violence or the use of force or coercion. The breach of those core principles turned out to be a slippery slope that expanded beyond anything that anyone could imagine at the time. And and it took me a very long time to admit, even to myself, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a disaster. Uh, but I finally had to come to that conclusion.
Yeah, that it would lead to hiring quotas, so to speak.
Yeah. It led to everything. It led to the whole protected groups. So in 1964, it was excused, and I remember thinking this way, on grounds that blacks represented a unique group in American history, that no one else had their experience, had suffered their oppression, and that amends were appropriate. And sooner we quickly found, oh, amends are also appropriate to women, and then to gays, and to and you start to go down the list of people that are protected groups, and we end up with identity politics and the situation that's been going on now for the last 30 years.
And slavery was certainly a great evil, but the slaveholders are all dead and the slaves are all dead. So it's how do you make up for this? It's
Yeah, I know.
ancestral punishments. I like to use the term victim politics instead of identity politics, but
Yeah, that's a good way of
all
putting
about
it.
who can be the biggest victim.
Yeah.
And there are people in our and I really do it. We do admire, for example, the people who have bad luck and overcome it. I mean, somebody
Yeah,
like
yeah.
Jim Abbott, who's born without a hand and then becomes a pitcher in Major League Baseball. We celebrate those people. And I think it's great that we do, but we don't just celebrate him because he was born without a hand. We celebrate him because of what he did in spite
Yeah,
of that.
exactly. Yeah.
It's Yeah, it's just, but now it seems as though we're just getting to the point where victims are. It's about being a victim, It's and you look at somebody like George Floyd too. I mean, this guy was not a model American by any standards.
Yeah, yes. The the celebration of pretty bad people.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I consider it with the whole trans thing now.
Oh yeah.
How do you celebrate a guy who's decided that he's a woman competing with other women in sports? I mean, that's the idea that they could be proud of winning in that kind of situation is just pathetic.
Yeah, and getting back to your teenage years, can you imagine a teenage boy saying, "Oh, you mean I can say I'm a woman and I can get into the girls' room and
Yes.
girls?" It's like, yeah, it's so I don't know where the logic went with all this. It's so amazing to watch it happen, And I know the sexual. Yeah, I was actually I was part of a camp in 1984 at Purdue, and Purdue was still divided. What there was the hall, there was the cafeteria in the middle, and all this stuff in the middle. But then on one side it was men, women, men on one side, women on the other, and the sign said, "Men permitted only when escorted by a woman," and on the other side too, "Women permitted only when escorted by a man."
Yeah.
That was in 1984, which I don't know if it's that way now, and I don't know if Purdue is probably more conservative than Harvard, but I really can't say.
Purdue had a really good president for a lot
Yeah.
many years in the form of Mitch Daniels. And by the way, the closest thing to a libertarian president that any university has had in, this century by far.
That would be a libertarian college president. I don't know if you ever had any encounter with George Roche at Hillsdale though, but
Oh, okay, yes, George
yeah.
Roche at Hillsdale would also fit, but, in terms of a public university, no, I can't think
Yeah,
of it.
Purdue was a public university
Yeah,
just like, Indiana was, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, true. We got some private schools out there,
yeah.
but in some ways, I think some of the private schools are probably even more woke than the public ones. Look for example at Oberlin in Ohio.
Yeah.
That's like a big one.
Yes. Well, how about Middlebury College in Vermont? Excuse me.
Yes.
Where I was attacked by a mob. Yeah, that's an example of a more problematic school than any of the public ones.
Yeah, I wasn't sure yet. You certainly, bore a lot of attacks in 1994. And, everybody forgets you had a co-author on the bell curve. I mean,
Yeah.
he died right after the book came out, so you ended up having to absorb all of the criticism. It was
Well, it is
I
true
mean,
that
yes, it was Richard Herrnstein, yeah, but
if Dick Herrnstein had been alive, it would have been a much different experience for me because we could just get on the phone with each other and commiserate with the idiotic things that were being said about us. But there would have been, well, it was two things. One is I was handling it all myself. And the second thing was that Dick and I had become extremely close during the 4 years we collaborated, very dear friends, and I was grieving. So I
yeah.
was both grieving the loss of really my best friend at that time and, uh, and trying to deal with the firestorm of, accusations. It was no fun. I, was once, interviewed by John McWhorter, the linguist who, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but, John is,
I've
really
heard of him.
he's become a public intellectual actually because he's, done podcasts and so forth, and I wouldn't call him conservative, but on matters of civil rights, he is much more the traditional equal opportunity rather than equal outcomes kind of guy. But anyway, he asked me how I dealt with, he asked me privately once how I dealt with, uh, the the criticism and so forth, and I said, "Well, I drank heavily." And later he was being interviewed publicly, and he mentioned that conversation, including
Yeah.
including my response, which I didn't mind. He did not say it in an accusatory way, but that was one of the ways I dealt with it. It seemed like an effective strategy.
Is working on a book together, is that kind of like having a baby? I mean, you work together and you have this.
Well, a lot of people find it very stressful because they have disagreements or they have different writing styles and so forth. The whole reason that I called up Dick Herrnstein to ask if he was already writing the book that I had in mind that became The Bell Curve was that I had read his book, IQ and the Meritocracy, and said, gee, this guy writes just like I do. I mean, his style is so similar. And the 4 years we worked on it, we had no knockdown dragouts. The way we did it was, we'd have the first draft done by one of us, and then we just pass that draft back and forth, and we wouldn't argue about it. One guy would just simply make the changes he wanted to make. He'd send back the amended version, and it'd go back and forth until we were both satisfied with it. It was a very it was nothing but pleasure, that collaboration. And that's the only book, I've co-authored except the one with my wife about the Apollo program, and that was done the same way. There was no stress in the marriage because of co-authoring the book.
Yeah,
It's unusual for people to have as stress-free co-authorships as I've had.
that's cool, yeah. Yeah, you wrote that book about the space program. Were you really fascinated by that or the
No,
Apollo program? Yeah.
were this was before Losing Ground was published that, I assumed that Losing Ground would not make a splash, and, Catherine and I were going to be married. We were married while Losing Ground was still being written, and, uh, so how were we gonna make a living? And, for reasons I won't go into, we found the topic of the guys on the ground during the Apollo program, the guys in mission control and the guys who built the launch vehicle, and nobody had told their story. And there were lots of characters there. There were lots of good stories, And there were lots of very successful nonfiction books at that time that sold a lot of money, sold a lot of copies, made a lot of money. A book called The Soul of a New Machine, for example, which was about the creation of a new model computer. And so, and also The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe, which was a bestseller about the Mercury program. So we had that idea. We liked the space program, and we were hard at work on that when all at once Losing Ground became a success. But we already had the book contract, and so we finished it. And I'm really glad we did. It was really fun to do the research for that and to write it.
I suppose Bell Curve was probably your most best-selling book just because of all the controversy, right?
By
Or
far, by far. Coming Apart also got a lot of press, and it sold a fair number of copies. But with the Bell Curve, it sold a couple 100,000 copies in hardback,
yeah,
and none of the others that I've written have come close to that. It was the only time in my life I've had discretionary income.
what percentage of Bell Curve critics that had actually would you say had actually read the book?
It has to be small. It has to be small because it would just betray it. The reviews would betray the fact that if they'd only read the chapter about race and they hadn't read that very carefully. And so I was able, when writing Coming Apart, to take the argument of the bell curve about the cognitive stratification and slip that into Coming Apart in the first few chapters. Not a single solitary reviewer of Coming Apart mentioned that I go through a lengthy recapitulation of the argument of the bell curve. None mentioned that.
What did you recapitulate from the Bell Curve?
It was the sorting that happened with the university system during the 1950s, switching from at Harvard and the other elite schools, switching from admitting a lot of rich kids, some of whom were
Yeah.
smart, to admitting a lot of smart kids, some of whom were rich, and the effect this had on changing the culture, of creating a cognitive elite that had not existed before, and the at the same time, the ways in which the people at the bottom of the bell curve, their lives were being made more difficult by the changes that were going on in policy.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, up until around you got to Harvard, I mean, a lot of Harvard students were just they went to Harvard because mom or dad went to Harvard, and they went
Yeah.
to Harvard because mom or dad went to Harvard, and just
Mhm.
but now it got to that point where the and maybe if you did go to college, you might have you might have went to, Iowa or Iowa
Of
State instead
course.
of
But
Harvard,
no
yeah.
nobody you didn't think about going, to Harvard if you lived in Newton, Iowa, the way I did. My 2 elder sisters both went to Iowa State,
Yeah,
for example.
that's another thing I respect. I always tell kids, nowadays, when you leave home, really leave. And, going from Iowa to Harvard, that's definitely really I say 1,000 miles. That's definitely really leaving.
It was moving into a different world.
It just
And
it creates a totally different attitude.
I will say parenthetically that I really enjoyed my undergraduate years. I loved Harvard at the time, but in retrospect, I always felt somewhat as an outsider that, there was even then a culture of the academic that I was not fully part of and didn't want to be part of. I remember my first week, at Harvard, I've learned that something like 80% of Harvard undergrads went directly to graduate school, and I said to myself, "I'm not gonna do that." And that which is sort of an indication of how removed I was from a lot of the assumptions that a lot of my classmates were making about their lives.
I do gotta ask, can you comment on this amazing man in Argentina before we go?
I really hope he pulls it off.
Yeah. Okay.
That is so exciting to see, what he has accomplished. I have not followed closely the problems he is also in, but I gather financially and budget-wise that there are problems that he's having to fight. But one would think that Argentinians would just see the huge change that he has, positive changes
Yeah,
that he has brought about, and say to themselves, "We can't go back. We've got to keep moving on this trail." I
it,
think it's phenomenal.
it is phenomenal. Yeah. Well, thank you, Charles Murray. Where can people find you out there?
Well, my work they can find on the AEI website. If you type into your browser AEI and then Murray, it'll bring up my AEI page,
Yeah.
and all of my articles are on there going way back,
Oh, yeah.
and then of course the books are all available on Amazon.
Okay. Well, thank you, Charles Murray. Please like this show, subscribe to the channel, go buy my novel, Escape from the Village. People are giving me money. It's buy me a coffee, and I do have a Substack. Thank you, Charles Murray. I'm Chris Baker.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you.